Welcome back. It's time now for the France at 24 debate. And today we're discussing the outcome of the Hanoi summit, which came to an abrupt end on Thursday morning. The meeting between the US President Donald Trump and North Korea's Kim Jong-un kicked off on Wednesday amidst great optimism that a deal would be struck in which punishing sanctions would be lifted on the condition that the secretive communist country denuclearize. But it didn't happen, and despite the friendly mood between the two men, who once called each other Little Rocket Man and a mentally deranged American dotard, no deal was reached. The highly anticipated signing ceremony didn't happen. Lunch was cancelled, and a jaded-looking President Trump boarded Air Force One back to Washington. Although he returns to the United States empty-handed, President Trump insists he wanted the right deal, not a rushed agreement. So, what went wrong? Does this mean we're back to square one? Was President Trump right to walk away? And should the US president really be travelling 13,000 kilometres in each direction without all the necessary groundwork having been done ahead of time? Well, those are some of the questions I'll be putting to our panel today. But first, here's France 24's James Vassina with a summary of how events unfolded there in Hanoi.
After an optimistic start, talks have taken an unexpected turn. The summit in Hanoi has drawn to an early end after discussions failed to lead to an agreement, with the two leaders cancelling a planned lunch and a signing ceremony. Exiting their one-on-one meeting, US President Donald Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un couldn't see eye to eye on one of the most crucial points of the summit.
Basically, they wanted the sanctions lifted in their entirety, and we couldn't do that. They were willing to denuke a large portion of the areas that we wanted, but we couldn't give up all of the sanctions for that.
And while Trump says the deal could have been signed today, he remained adamant. More efforts must be made if the two countries are to cooperate.
We had some options, and at this time we decided not to do any of the options, and we'll see where that goes, but it was a very interesting 2 days, and I think actually it was a very productive 2 days, but sometimes you have to walk, I hope.
Earlier in the day, discussions seemed promising after Kim Jong-un appeared to show willingness when asked if he would commit to denuclearization. After a failure to deliver concrete results in Hanoi, plans for a third summit are now off the table.
So President Donald Trump returns to Washington, where he now faces a certain amount of domestic turmoil, and yet despite his initial optimism, he's being denied what was a much-needed triumph. Well, here to discuss all these developments in the studio with us is Annick Cizel, who is a senior lecturer in US foreign policy and transatlantic relations at the Paris Sorbonne Nouvelle University. Thank you very much for coming back to see us. We're also joined by Associate Professor Benoit Pelopidas. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. You are at Sciences Po and also the founding director of the Nuclear Knowledges Programme and a visiting fellow at Princeton University's Programme on Science and Global Security. Thank you so much. From Washington, we're joined by Walter Lohman, who is the director of the Asia Studies Center at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you so much for speaking to us. And also from Washington is Michael O'Hanlon, a senior fellow and director of research and foreign policy at the Brookings Institution. Michael, in Washington, I would like to start with you. President Trump is coming back to Washington without a deal. Was he right to try to get one?
Yes, I think he was right to try, and I think he was right to walk away from what was on the table. And I say that not as a big supporter of President Trump overall in his foreign policy, and also sometimes concerned by the statements he'll make about the North Korea issue. For example, his apparent criticisms of the South Korean ally and alliance that we have with the ROK, his demands on them for greater burden sharing, his discussion of our exercises is very provocative, his claim last summer that we had already essentially denuclearized the North Korea problem. He says a lot of things that are wrong, but I think the overall spirit of trying to establish a bond or a rapport with Kim while also keeping strong sanctions on and being clear that while we will compromise, we're not going to compromise and agree to a bad deal where we give up all the sanctions and all the leverage in exchange for a very small part of what we are after. Those pieces of the Trump approach I support. So on balance, I'm still hopeful, and I think he did basically the right thing by making the trip to Vietnam and basically the right thing by leaving.
Okay, let me go to Walter Lohman at the Heritage Foundation. I mean, we're doing a post-mortem really here of what happened in Hanoi. And I just want to ask you, I mean, do you think Kim underestimated Trump and that, in all his enthusiasm, Kim thought, well, perhaps President Trump will pretty much sign anything? Has he underestimated Donald Trump?
Could be. I think there's two options here. One is either he did underestimate Trump. He thought that he could go around Pompeo and Bolton and others and go straight to the top and get the sort of answers he wanted. There's sort of a narrative out there that says that that's the way you can play Donald Trump. So either, yeah, maybe he did underestimate him, or maybe he didn't want an agreement, and he just wants to go through the motions to get an agreement, to get the public and international exposure that it gives him on the stage, but really doesn't want an agreement, so he put forward a proposal that he knew would be rejected.
Okay, let me come to you back here in the studio. Annick, let me start with you in the studio. I mean, do you think that Donald Trump is saying that this was a very productive meeting? Do you think he is returning to Washington entirely empty-handed, or is he saying it was productive just to sort of save face?
Well, he's preserved the status quo. I mean, he's preserved the fact that there has been no testing of missiles or ICBMs or nuclear forces by North Korea since now September and November 2017. So this status quo may be glorified as something of a victory, except that nothing that was put forward in Singapore has been elaborated upon ever since. It's been months and months and months of negotiations with Steve Biegun, with Mike Pompeo, and nothing seems to be moving forward. And nothing was prepared, in any case, prepared enough for the two heads of state to conclude on anything more than the stalemate we have since September, November 2017. So in that sense, it seems like pretty much we're playing back the Korean War again. We have an armistice, but we still don't have a victory on either side.
Okay, let me put this to you, Benoit Pelopidas. What went wrong in your view, and are you surprised that President Donald Trump is returning empty-handed?
So, I'd like to respond to that by saying that it's tempting to say it's a predictable failure. Basically, experts who would focus on material capabilities are going to be tempted to say there's nothing that could come out of North Korea ever, and they tend to forget that, for example, in the late 1990s, basically the Perry process managed to get some motion out of North Korea. But what's interesting to me in this is that President Trump's strategy is to essentially control the narrative. And in that respect, when he says, I'm not in a rush, it's striking to me that he's sort of more in a rush than Kim Jong-un because President Trump is facing re-election. The North Korean counterpart isn't.
Yeah, let me just go back to Michael O'Hanlon. I mean, Michael, it seems surprising, doesn't it, that the US president would deploy all those resources, fly on Air Force One 13,000 kilometers in each direction to Hanoi for a summit where, the groundwork doesn't seem to have been done ahead of time.
Well, you're right that it sort of flies in the face of classic diplomatic strategy. But in this particular case, I think that Trump was actually well enough briefed on the big picture that trying to establish a rapport with Kim was worth it. Because let's face it, we're putting a lot of pain and hurt on the North Korean economy. Sanctions were imposed in 2016 and 17 that have led to about a 50% reduction in North Korean trade. The North Korean economy is still afloat, and it's partly privatized, and it's got some good innovation, but it's not going to grow fast without access to the outside economy. And so if President Trump is going to sustain that kind of pressure, I think it's actually useful that he have this rapport with Kim so that we don't wind up where we were again in 2017 with the kind of insults and brinkmanship potentially bringing us to the cusp of conflict. So I don't mind this apparent waste of presidential time. By the way, if he had stayed in Washington this week, what was he going to do? He was going to tweet about the Michael Cohen trials, which if some of your followers in Europe are sparing themselves from this American travesty, they're very wise because it's ugly and it's not clear what productive work is going to be getting done in Washington this week in any event. So I don't mind the investment investment of time. But I do think it raises the obvious question of where we go from here. I don't think that I or President Trump, especially President Trump, has thought through his answer to that question. But as for sort of letting Kim Jong-un know that we're not going to sign up to a lousy deal and that President Trump can't be easily sort of, brought into that kind of a bad arrangement just for the sake of bragging rights or his pursuit of a Nobel Peace Prize or re-election campaign talking points, I think it was good for Kim Jong-un to learn that directly by realizing that Trump would walk. So I have no major complaints about what happened this week.
Walter Lohman, your thoughts on that? I see you smiling there also in Washington. What are your thoughts?
I agree with Michael that it was the right thing to do to walk away. As to whether it was worth traveling halfway around the world to do it, I think at this point, it's already 2 years into this administration. I think we all have to just accept that he has a different way of doing business than other presidents. So yeah, for most people that study diplomacy and look at how this is supposed to be done, this is not the way you do it. You work out all the details beforehand, and then the boss goes and he signs a deal. But clearly, Trump has a good deal of faith in his own negotiating skills. He's built a whole career around it. Now, you could agree with him or disagree about how good those skills are, but he thinks he has them. He thinks he's necessary to close a deal. I think one positive side effect of this could be a signal that he sends to others that the United States is in negotiation with, the Taliban, for example, or with Xi Jinping. So Xi Jinping has to now better appreciate maybe that at the end of the day, maybe everything's not going to be okay in his negotiations with them on the trade side. Trump could walk away. Not only that, but you cannot work around Trump. And I think that was the whole point of the press conference Trump had in the Oval Office a week ago with the Chinese to demonstrate basically, hey, I'm the guy you have to come to, and you can't go around me, you can't go around my advisors.
Yeah, I mean, it does beg the question. I mean, the self-styled deal maker that Donald Trump is. I mean, did he have a strategy to begin with? Because I mean, his deal broking might work very well, in the real estate world of New York. But does it work? And are those same skills applicable and useful on the international stage? Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, it's not so much the skills I worry about, because I suppose at some level the skills are very similar that you need. It's the background information and what he's willing to live with in terms of risk and in terms of a deal in the end. I mean, from the beginning, I have not supported this whole process because I'm not hopeful for a deal, and I see the president with the prospect of giving away some things without actually getting what he needs, which is the complete denuclearization of North Korea. And so him not knowing all the details there and not having the background of it, that's what concerns me the most, that we could have had a deal, because let's face it, that's what we were all worried about. I mean, on my part, I was worried we would get a deal. I wasn't worried he'd walk away. I was worried he'd get a bad deal that leaves North Korea in possession of up to as many 60 nuclear weapons, leaves our allies vulnerable, and lifts sanctions on them. So, yeah, it's basically his knowledge and his willingness to admit that he doesn't know everything that worries me more than anything else. But seems like he came to grips with this on this trip. It seems like he listened to Bolton and Pompeo, and I think he made the right call.
Well, except that he had to listen to many voices inside the administration, because in the few days just before the Hanoi meeting, we heard voices that were different from Dan Coates and Gina Haspel, who were saying that, wait a minute, we cannot strike a deal because there's been no denuclearization whatsoever that's been happening ever since Singapore. Obviously, there were many voices even heard during the press conference when President Trump himself was leaving his Secretary of State take from the front stage before him and being his spokesperson. It was a very weird, strange press conference to a certain extent, as if President Trump was sort of afraid of himself and pushing forward Mike Pompeo as the professional in the room to handle the questions in the press conference and make sure that nothing was going was going to be said that was not scripted with the administration and actually could be made official. So to a certain extent, yes, President Trump has stopped tweeting in the past couple of days, but he's even let his Secretary of State take the stand, to the point that the State Department at the very same time was releasing a press communique about Russia and about Ukraine. It's like Mike Pompeo was really running the job of, shall I say, commander-in-chief at the time when the Pentagon has a number 2 at its head, but not even a Secretary of Defense anymore.
Yeah.
Let's go. No,
well, I think we have to, like I said, I think we have to acknowledge it's weird, it's different. And, I mean, it's been going on for 2 years now. I don't know what else we can do except to look at it for what it is. That is the way he conducts business.
But the conversation we're having, if I may jump in on that, is focused on the skills of the president and of his counterpart. And to me, in a way, what you're saying about the multiple voices, if we're serious about the US-North Korean discussion, the goal of denuclearization, or even of serious constraints on their nuclear program, it's going to probably go beyond the possible end of the second term of President Trump, which would be 2025. So the whole idea that it's not a US-Korean strategy, but it's a Trump-Kim, like very personalized practice that is conducted in itself is a little bit puzzling.
But it does look like that, doesn't it? I mean, that's the way they're positioning it themselves. It's not us who are saying that's what it is. It's these two men sometimes having talks amongst themselves without their own top brass being present in the room. So they've made it about, our brotherly sort of friendship is how they position it. I know, Michael O'Hanlon, you have to leave us fairly soon. So I just want to ask you for your sort of prediction as to where we go from here. I mean, is there going to be a third summit?
Well, I'm not sure it makes a lot of sense to fly halfway around the world again. I wouldn't be surprised if they wind up finding a way to meet when Trump's, on a swing through Asia or something like that. I'm not sure that it would be appropriate, even though I've defended the first two, to have a third summit that requires this much presidential investment when you expect the payoff to be pretty mediocre. But I also like the idea of the friendliness being sustained in the personal chemistry, even as the two nations have policies that are largely at loggerheads. So maybe a briefer visit at a time when President Trump is swinging through. And by the way, it wouldn't be so bad if that happened in Seoul and involved the South Korean president in a three-way summit, because we have to make sure we don't see the US-ROK alliance weaken throughout this whole process.
Yeah, that's a very good point, actually. And perhaps, indeed, Seoul will be the next venue for the round 3 of these discussions. Thank you so much for speaking to us, Michael O'Hanlon, a Senior Fellow and Director of Research and Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution. You've had the last word in the first half. Don't go away. I'll be back in a couple of minutes. Welcome back. It's time now for part 2 of the France 24 debate. Today we're doing a post-mortem on the latest efforts by President Donald Trump to persuade North Korea's Kim Jong-un to give up his nuclear arsenal. And it seems that Trump's efforts in Hanoi have not borne fruit. The meeting came to an abrupt end and he returns to Washington empty-handed. Today we're asking what went wrong and what happens next. Well, we can start the second half by listening in to how some of America's regional allies have digested this news. Let's start by listening in to the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who had words of support for President Donald Trump's decision to walk away without a deal.
I fully support Mr. Trump's decision not to easily compromise, based on his strong determination to achieve the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, keep on having constructive talks, and to encourage North Korea's concrete actions.
Okay, the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe sounding supportive there. Meanwhile, the spokesperson for the South Korean presidency expressed some regret and disappointment about this outcome in Hanoi. Here's what they had to say.
We regret that no deal was reached at the summit between Chairman Kim Jong-un and President Trump. But it seems clear that the two sides have made meaningful progress.
Okay, that was a spokesperson for the South Korean presidency. And just before the break, we were talking about how the next summit, if there is another summit, could be held perhaps in Seoul. I just wonder, Benoit, what do you think of that suggestion that perhaps Seoul could be a logical venue for round 3 and perhaps a 3-way discussion at that point?
So what we just heard sounds like the South Koreans would welcome it because they're very much looking forward to progress on the issue. Then the question is whether that's what we talked about in the first half of the debate, whether we can learn anything from past symmetry. So from past symmetry, we would get to say, okay, symmetry is good if it allows leaders to build trust. But in the case of President Trump and Chairman Kim, it's difficult to say that because we had insults first, and we know that basically President Trump's judgment on business partners can change very rapidly. So in a way, for the scholar, it's very, either disheartening or exciting because basically the past is not prologue.
Yeah, South Korea's Yonhap news agency said earlier on today that the security situation on the Korean peninsula is now, and I quote, back to zero. Diplomacy is now at a crossroads. That's the Yonhap news agency's take on this. Is that perhaps a little bit of an exaggeration? And we're not back to zero, are we, if we consider where zero can actually be?
Well, I think we must not forget to praise the South Korean diplomacy for where we're at today. Soft power has been in the hands of South Korea in these past few months. I'm thinking back of the Olympics here on this. And joint teams may seem like between North and South Korean athletes, it may seem like trivial. It's not trivial at all. Definitely, it's Moon Jae-in's administration, government, that has reached out to the North Koreans to prepare the grounds somehow for the big meeting between Donald Trump and between the Americans and the North Koreans, and try and build a bridge towards more than the armistice, towards what we were still hoping for 24 hours ago, that is a declaration of intent towards peace in the peninsula. And definitely they've been the first actor, the prime mover in the region, bring the Americans to the table when Donald Trump was saying little rocket man, etc., was playing his own game of brinkmanship on his side, his peace through strength and maximum pressure sanctions on North Korea, at the same time as Kim Jong-un was playing his brinkmanship. And we were, like 18 months ago, in the middle of this sort of preventive escalation, bilateral, which was, like the rest of the world, we were holding our breath. Moon Jae-in, when he came to power in South Korea, started this détente, starting to say, okay, we are open for dialogue. And he was the prime mover in where we're at today and this easing up of tensions.
Yeah, but Japan, a lot more hawkish, weren't they? They were a lot more... certainly just listening to that message of support, you've done the right thing, don't rush into a deal. But even before that, the narrative from Tokyo seemed to be much more steady on here. Let's not give too much away. Does that sound like a fair reading of events?
That sounds fair, and I'm saying that not being a Japan specialist at all, but what that tells us is that essentially nuclear politics is often not just about nuclear weapons, and it's also sometimes not just about even international politics, but it's a lot also about domestic politics and how the Japanese prime minister may play the alliance with the United States domestically, and how basically in return President Trump would play that for his domestic constituency.
Let me just...
And if I may, excuse me, and also the very transformation, the domestic transformation of Japan into potentially a military power again. And this is an uneasy transformation for the population inside, too. So there's definitely a domestic agenda at the same time as a very regional agenda, because we must keep in mind that warships are just like cruising side by side from different nationalities all the time, and they're watching this very carefully.
Let me just go back to Walter Lohman in Washington. You're listening very patiently there, and if you'd like to make any observations about what's been said so far, please do. And let me put this to you. How do you think all of this has been viewed then by America's allies in the Asia-Pacific region, and also by countries like China?
Well, I think the Japanese, one, we've been talking about them a little bit. I mean, they have a lot riding on these talks. They have the abductee issue, which resonates very loudly in Japan. And so Abe has to look out for that issue. He wants the return of Japanese abductees. But in the lead up to the summit, the Japanese were also nervous about a deal that would basically sacrifice their strategic interest. If Trump had reached some sort of deal that covered, for instance, just ICBMs, just the ability of North Korea to reach the United States, which it does have, and probably has the capability of putting a nuclear warhead on one of those missiles. If he had reached that sort of deal, he would have left the Japanese hanging out there. So, I think the Japanese have a lot riding on this, a lot that we don't often think about or don't think about often enough. In terms of where we go next, I think it's virtually impossible that Donald Trump's going to get on an airplane and go back to Asia, travel 13,000 kilometers, as you say, to go to anywhere in the East in order to have another summit. He's coming back here to Washington. He's going to be jumping right into politics, and then we're into next year into the presidential campaign very much in earnest. So I don't see much hope there. I think we're actually probably going to go back to a more traditional way of handling this, in that I don't think they meet again unless there's some sort of certainty that they're going to have an agreement. And then if I just comment briefly on Moon Jae-in's role in this, I agree that he has been central in this. I don't agree that it's been a good thing. I think that the United States should have stuck with its earlier policy of applying maximum pressure to North Korea. I didn't like the comments, the Rocket Man and all that stuff myself, but at least the policy of maximum pressure should have been maintained until we got North Korea further along the road of being able to offer some kind of concessions. They've offered nothing, and we're the ones already that have given concessions. We have canceled exercises by our militaries to make sure that we're ready to deal with this challenge. We offered, by going to Hanoi, we actually give Kim Jong-un a good deal of prestige in that way. So far we've gotten nothing. I don't see what this process has gotten us that maximum pressure did not get us.
Let me just pick up on a point that actually you, Benoit Pelopidas, were mentioning just before we took the break, in fact, that perhaps there was some kind of a misunderstanding there, because we heard from Pyongyang a little earlier on this evening, so a good 12 hours after those talks had finished, that they didn't ask for all sanctions to be lifted. They only asked for 5 or so types of sanctions to be lifted. Has there been a bit of a case of lost in translation in all of this, do you think?
So it's really hard to tell, but for sure, given that both parties were playing up the expectations of the summit, the next game will be to both maintain the idea that there are good relationships and still putting the blame for failure on the other side. So basically, President Trump started it by saying, we had to walk away because the North Koreans' demands were maximalist. And then basically the North Koreans are just responding to that by trying to put the blame back on to the American side.
Sorry, you wanted to say something about that?
Yes, it really sounds like a pretense on both sides at this point. And I can't help looking for, a larger picture or something, what we're missing, obviously, because it's not made official, but from this summit. Definitely, it was striking during President Trump's press conference how many Chinese journalists were in the room, and actually wanted to speak with the French president, with the American president. And it was striking to the level of interest that the Chinese press was putting not so much in the trade deal, which is being negotiated, but in this nuclear deal. Also, I was mentioning just in passing how it's troubling that the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, might be at the very same time, he's on his way to the Philippines, so he's still in Asia. At the very same time, there's a press communique that comes out of the State Department stating that Crimea is Ukraine, pointing the finger at Russia, possibly to try and divert the whatever Michael Cohen, whatever domestic stuff is going on, but placing back the nuclear deal with North Korea at the center of where it should be. That is placing back at the same time China and Russia where they stand, towering above that nuclear deal, non-deal so far, at the same time. It's not just President Trump and Chairman Kim. But it's also the signatories, of course, to the Korean armistice. But the implicit non-signatory of 1953, the USSR didn't sign anything, but it was party to the Korean War, and it definitely is today to whatever talks on denuclearization that are taking place. I'm just wondering if all of this is not just a pretext, definitely, okay, the sanctions a little bit, not too much, etc. This is what we are being told, but it seems that, I mean, to walk out of such a meeting and insisting on its friendship. No one walked away, no doors were slammed. And monitoring so carefully with Mike Pompeo what is being said and therefore left unsaid definitely seems to be diverting our attention to details when there's a much larger picture which is being drawn behind the scenes.
What are your thoughts on that?
That's the issue of diversion seems crucial. And if we're back to the nuclear dimension in general, we also need to remember the bigger nuclear picture, which is interesting because the Trump administration has just started huge, to use a word that he likes particularly, nuclear modernization program that is supposed to cost $1.7 trillion. But here's the interesting thing is that the modernization plan is barely modified from the one that the Obama administration had essentially pre-planned. And so that's, I was talking earlier about my dissatisfaction with the short-sightedness of bonding between two men, because that's not going to go further than 6 or 7 years into the future. If we're talking about the modernization program, it's going into 30, 40 years into the future. So if we were talking seriously about nuclear politics, we would be talking about multiple temporalities and much longer timeframes, which this is what I tried to say earlier.
And forgive me one last time. And the larger picture is in the State of the Union address by President Trump when he said that he was ready, possibly or not, to renegotiate the INF treaty, also with China. And he said maybe China is not going to will it, but maybe they will. So obviously this is almost like the small detail, what has just happened these past couple of days, or maybe the core, the nucleus, I don't know, of a much larger picture, which is being negotiated right now, so it seems.
Walter, I know you're standing by very patiently there in Washington. Feel free to add your comments to those observations. And also, I mean, let me put this question to you. Do you think that the fact that now Kim Jong-un has got a bit of a taste for being on the international scene, he's no longer a complete outcast internationally, doesn't that make things rather more difficult for him moving forwards to perhaps carry out missile tests when he gets back home? He's sort of changed, the whole scene has changed a bit, hasn't it?
No, I don't think so. I don't think he has any more leeway to do that. I mean, you could argue that he shouldn't be given such a stage because of the type of regime that he rules, but I don't think he'll feel any compunction at all in that regard. But going back to the matter of keeping your eye on the larger picture really is that Kim Jong-un has between 20 and 60 nuclear weapons, several of them that can reach the United States. That's the bigger picture. The bigger picture is the fact that there's a state of war on the peninsula. There's not a state of war because we lack a piece of paper that says that there's not. It's because of the nature of the Korean regime, the North Korean regime, and the aims that it has for South Korea. North Korea wants to unite the entire peninsula under its rule. And for some reason, we have a hard time accepting that. We want to accept that he's just like any other president. He's like the French president or the prime minister of Great Britain that we can sit down and we can work. He's not working on the same calculus. We also always paper over the absolute horrid nature of this regime. They've got between 80 and 120,000 people in gulags, merciless type gulags in North Korea. The man murders people at the drop of a hat. That's what we're dealing with. That's the bigger picture. And it's going to take a lot more than traveling to Hanoi and signing a piece of paper to fix it.
Your thoughts here in the studio?
Well, I just don't believe it. I agree with what Mr. Lohman has just said. I just don't think that North Korea has any plan to expand its brand of communism to the south at this stage. I mean, I don't think it's an expansionist power.
Completely bankrupt, completely cash-strapped.
They have absolutely no means to do that. whatsoever.
I mean, isn't Kim Jong-un sort of on bended knee, cap in hand? I mean, he needs money and he needs it fast.
It seems to be the model, the exemplar that President Trump has just presented him with, which is Vietnam, which is this impossible peace between the United States and Vietnam that President Clinton managed to achieve, and the deluge of foreign assistance that the United States has poured on Vietnam, sustaining a regime which is a mixed type of regime, a communist political regime, but economically, I hesitate to say flourishing, because not for everyone in Vietnam, but definitely rising up, emerging gradually as a regional power to reckon with, economically speaking. And definitely this is the model of the impossible reconciliation towards economic improvement and potential prosperity that President Trump has presented Kim Jong-un with.
Do you think it was a useful and attractive sort of parallel for him to be drawing, President Trump, when he said, look, this is what you could become? Because, of course, Kim Jong-un must be wondering later on down the line, where am I going to fit into this new North Korea? Do you think that was a useful parallel to present him with and say, you could be like this country here?
So I think psychologizing on one Chairman Kim thinks is an impossible task. So I'm not going to venture into that. But what was striking to me is that he wants to have a voice. One of the things that happened that was interesting is that he apparently replied directly to one of the questions that were asked, and like he wasn't expected.
More than one of the reporters. Yeah, he jumped in a few times.
So he wants to kind of have a voice and be really perceived as a leader of his own kind. And just to go back to what Mr. Lohman was saying earlier, I don't see that any of the analysts has likable words for the North Korean regime. I don't really think the underestimation of the cruelty of the regime is that, or is being debated really.
No, I mean, it seems that... Go ahead.
Well, yeah, I agree with you that. I trust that. And I think it's not being debated, but sometimes I think we don't account for it. And we don't account for the possibility that Kim Jong-un has an entirely different sort of calculus than we have. For instance, you talk about there's no prospect for North Korea to ever take over the entire peninsula. There is a scenario that gets you there. It involves nuclear weapons, it involves a 1 million-man army on the border, and it involves separating South Korea from the United States. So, for instance, you sign a piece of paper that says that the war is over, despite the fact that it's the most heavily militarized border in the world, and the U.S. pulls its troops out. You know, Kim Jong-un then has a much stronger position there in terms of intimidating the South. More so if he has nuclear weapons and he can hold the United States off at arm's length, and he can hold Japan off or anyone else. So it's not entirely impossible that under the right circumstances, North Korea could coerce the South into at least a very unfavorable kind of arrangement that amounts to concession on South Korea's part. I mean, you've got to go out, a good long time, 5-10 years to get out there. But he doesn't have the same sort of calculus we do. And he's certainly not going to respond to these videos of how great the beaches can be in North Korea. I mean, that's just silly. That's not going to appeal to him at all. And I actually don't think that Vietnam's economic model is going to appeal to him either. He's been to Beijing now. He's seen the way that the Chinese do it. That has never worked as an inducement either. And I don't think the Vietnam model works as well.
No, I just don't see the North Koreans going for a first strike. I mean, they know immediately what would happen to them. So defending themselves, placing themselves around the table as international negotiators, which is what having nuclear weapons has made them capable of, is definitely what they're going for. Striking first South Korea, invading South Korea. I don't even think the Chinese would let them do it.
No, the Chinese would surely be the first to jump in at that stage.
That shows us one of the challenges of the game of Kim's mind reading, because on the one hand, if we accept this scenario, then we basically grant him the status of a very, very skilled manipulator who's also very willing to take risk and absorb large scales of casualties, which he did, arguably in some ways. But if he is that, then it's hard to maintain that position and also the position that says there is a point in negotiating with that man. If you regard him this way, then you shouldn't say that we need to negotiate with him.
OK, we're sort of running low on time. Let's start thinking ahead now, just as we enter the final phases of this debate, as to where we go to from here. One of the parallels that the White House, by the way, was keen to draw on today after that non-agreement was the 1987 Reykjavik summit between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. That was a meeting about nuclear weapons, and it was a meeting which ended without a deal. But it did, say the White House today, and at the time, lay the groundwork for further useful meetings in the future. So where do we go to from here is the question. And I mean, is the onus on North Korea or on the United States to come up with a plan for how we move forward from here? Walter, your thoughts?
Well, I think the onus is on North Korea. There was clearly a deal to be had somehow, and they could not get to the denuclearization part. I think that denuclearization is the purpose of this whole thing. And if we're not getting to that, then we're not engaged in a process that furthers America's interests. Ending the state of the war on the Korean Peninsula means nothing to me if Kim Jong-un is left with 60 nuclear weapons, some of which can strike the United States. I think what we end up doing is we continue to muddle through this process, probably at lower levels without prospect of a big meeting, and we see where it goes. I have no problem with maintaining the sanctions, even ratcheting up the sanctions and keeping a door open to be able to pulse the North Korean side to see when they're ready to actually denuclearize.
Okay, your thoughts?
Assuming that both sides agree one day on what denuclearization means, which they don't at this stage, but assuming they do at some stage, the United States is there's one trend that's been non-negotiable for the Trump administration in all of it, which is complete, irreversible, verifiable denuclearization. But who's going to verify? Is going to be one of the points that are just impossible for the Trump administration itself to reconcile itself with. It should be the International Atomic Energy Agency, which they have recused about Iran, which the Trump administration refuses to believe that they're capable of assessing the Iranian stockpiles, etc. So it means that even the Americans need to get their act more clear than this if they ever wish to define which denuclearization they wish for and who's going to verify. It's obvious that for the North Koreans, it's not going to be the Americans alone. This is obvious.
Benoit, I'm going to give you the last word because we're almost out of time.
Right, thank you. So then I'll respond briefly on the Reykjavik analogy. So once we know the unpredictability of what comes next, the analogies that we use will tell us a lot about how we position people. So, beyond the fact that North Korea is not the Soviet Union under Secretary Gorbachev, playing the Reykjavik analogy is giving a lot of credit to Kim Jong-un for making most concessions, which Secretary Gorbachev did. And it's also, interestingly, emphasizing the fact that there was trust and mutual support between the two leaders. And so it's basically letting President Trump's narrative of friendship kind of have the last word.
Okay, so a rather flattering analogy, therefore, put forward by the White House this morning in response to this. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much. You've had the last word. Benoit Pelopidas at Sciences Po, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. Thank you to you, Annick Cizel from the Paris Sorbonne Nouvelle University. And last but not least, in Washington, Walter Lohman, the Director of the Asian Studies Center at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you very much indeed to you. That was the France 24 debate.